Great. Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Atlantic Council, an event hosted in tandem by the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and the Global Energy Center. Our eminent director, Ambassador Morningstar, is here in the front row. Greetings, Dick. Our topic today is regional integration, the growing role of LNG in Latin America, and it's probably worth taking a couple of minutes just to set the stage, because the story of natural gas in Latin America has really been quite volatile over the last couple of decades. It's certainly a region that has enormous resources. Bolivia has a tremendous amount of natural gas. Venezuela has a tremendous amount of natural gas. But over the years, between politics and fiscal frameworks and subsidies, sometimes all the gas that's available doesn't get produced. And fiscal crises in particular countries have interrupted supply, and so not all the gas which was supposed to be delivered from one side of the border makes it to the other side of the border. So there's a lot of great potential for regional integration, and there are some very significant cross-border linkages, Bolivia, Brazil, for one. But this energy insecurity, 2001 and 2006 in particular, really opened the door for liquefied natural gas, as countries decided they wanted to hedge their bets on some of the cross-border trade and be sure they could get gas from the outside. And so now Brazil, of course, is a major LNG importer. Argentina is a major LNG importer. Chile really started the process as a very significant importer, and I think Peru is the region's only exporter. So where countries get their gas from has changed. And the role of natural gas in the energy economies of the hemisphere has changed also. I think some of that has happened because the region is primarily dependent on hydropower, and there has been a lot of success in introducing renewables into many of these countries as well. But the weather is not a friend, and so you not only have to compensate for the dry season, but for some very significant periods of drought. So gas is needed, but it's very hard to determine how much and exactly when. And now that countries have taken on their Paris commitments and are trying to reduce their carbon footprints, the question is, what's the direction going to be? What's the share of gas? What's the share of renewables? What will the share of hydro be? And then we have some questions on the supply side as well. You know, Argentina, with its market-moving, Vaca Muerta project, is very hopeful. Brazil is a major producer of oil and gas, but not necessarily producing the gas in the place where the consumption centers need it. So there's a question of whether the production profile is going to impact LNG or not. And then finally, the LNG market itself is changing, whereas the world of long-term contracts, 20-year contracts with high volumes and oil linkages is really disappearing. Now there's not as much oil linkage, terms are shorter, volumes are shorter, there's a big spot market, and so there's a question of how these countries will buy LNG. Will they buy it on long-term contracts, or will they keep buying on spot? So we are very fortunate today, in the midst of this uncertainty and questions, to have four tremendous leaders from the hemisphere to talk about the role of LNG in their countries' economies, how the infrastructure is getting built, and then we'll talk afterwards about how the market structures are impacting them. So Gonzalo Aguirre, did I say that right? Yep, from Argentina's Ministry of Energy. We'll talk about really all the changes happening in Argentina. Jose Maria Castro, who's the general manager of Colombia's SPEC LNG project. We'll talk about that, and his board chairman, Ricardo Fernandez Malavet from Promigas, is here. He's got to take care of the chairman. And then Giovani Machado from Brazil's Energy Planning Ministry is here as well to talk about Brazil's plans. And then our own Saarnio, today not the acting, but the now finalized Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Energy and Natural Resources Bureau, is here to talk to us about the U.S. perspective. So what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about each country, their perspective, and then we'll come back and talk about regional integration and market structures and how you finance LNG projects in this very uncertain world. So Gonzalo, let me start with you. Let's paint a picture for us about Argentina, and tell us a little bit about what's the role of gas going to be in Argentina's energy economy, and then what's the role of LNG in particular in that mix.
Okay. Well, as you may all know, in Argentina, natural gas is the major source of primary energy. It's around 54% nowadays, and we expect to keep growing. Of course, our government is also making a lot of efforts in the area of renewables energy, and we want to go that direction as well. But that will go on I would say, on a probably a slower pace. In order to increase the participation of natural gas in the energy matrix, of course, our main view of the future would lie on Vaca Muerta, the unconventional reservoir that we have in the Neuquén Basin. This is where we expect to grow on gas production quite significantly. We have been working with the producers in order to try to estimate what would be the production for gas from this area. And we expect if things go well that we'll probably be able to increase natural gas production on around 30% in a 15-year time. This is our expectation with regards to Vaca Muerta. In the meantime, until we get there, and of course the consumption of the country will also be growing in the way, we are going to keep the contract that we have with Bolivia. For you to have an idea, Argentina consumes around, I'm going to speak in cubic meters, sorry for this, but around 120, 130 general during the year. And in the winter months, 4 or 5 months a year, depending on the temperature, we get to consume 160, sometimes 170. This last winter was a warmer one, so we didn't have to hit those consumption levels. But the idea is that Vaca Muerta would drive all the gas production for the following years. And in the way to get there during these 15 years, LNG will become is already a very important part of our energy supply needs and to secure the supply needs. Nowadays, we have two LNG terminals that are operating during the winter times. Sometimes they pump into the system at their maximum level, which will be around the 20 million cubic meters. So the capacity for the two terminals pumping on their highest capacity would be around 40 million. The problem that we have in the country is that we're still, especially for power plants and for industries that consume 64% of all the gas in Argentina, they are still needing some gas, and sometimes even with LNG it's not enough to provide the whole system. So then they have to import gas oil or fuel oil, which is much more expensive. So the idea that we have in the country is for the future we would welcome if there's a possibility of having another terminal, another LNG terminal, so that we can secure for the power plants and the industry all the gas that is still needed. In the same path, we'll just put out all our efforts from the government perspective in trying to help the producers to develop Vaca Muerta. That's why we created a program that will run for the next 4 years, starting in January 1st, 2018, where they will get a differential price for the gas that comes from unconventional reservoirs. On the other hand, we keep trying to normalize the gas natural market by liberating the gas prices on the wellhead that were still during these 12 or 15 years. That was a different policy that came from the government. So the idea is that those prices will be liberated in a three years period of time. By the end of the day, wellhead prices for gas will be free, and then distribution and transmission, as it always is still being regulated. But as David said, Vaca Muerta is probably where we head for the future, and of course it will also be some other opportunities, for example the offshore bidding rounds that we will be launching, but we don't know to what extent that will become also a source of natural gas. But that's more or less a general view of the country.
So you've got, if you're a gas producer, you've got that floor price. You have essentially an economic incentive to keep producing. But if you're an LNG importer, what's the regulatory framework? What incentivizes you to get into the LNG business when you have such uncertainty about both the price and the quantity of demand? Is there a regulatory incentive?
No, in general, I would say that for an importer of gas, they just have to make an agreement on the price, but that will be free. They will have to, if they want to sell to the industries or whether they want to sell to the power plants, that will not be a problem on the price for that LNG that is imported. That is free because that will go to those industries that the government has, for the time being, has no request on what is the price that can be sold to those parts of the market. The only thing in which the government has put a price and a path of price in order to normalize it was in the gas that is sold to the residential users. So that will be idea for LNG imported, as long as they can have a contract and they can bring the gas in, the terminal is already there, and in order to regasify as much as possible as the contracts.
And right now, the LNG import terminals that are there, those are private or those are government?
No, those are, at the time being, those are government. Not government, one of the companies that operates the company is YPF, which has a 51% stake. The government has a 51% stake, but YPF gets a fee for just regasifying, and then the contract is between the one that is. I mean, we as a government, if we know the needs for the system, for the power plants or for the industries, we ask YPF or Energética, which is the other company, to buy the LNG cargo that we need, and we bring it in. So is the government the one that sees the needs from the system and tell YPF to come and buy that cargo? But the price, if they sell it, if we put it to the power plants, that will be a free price.
Okay, terrific. Well, let me turn to Jose Maria next. So we've got a new LNG project in Colombia. Tell us a little bit about the project and how you've set it up. Who's your customer? And there are a lot of folks in the audience who probably want to know who's your supplier as well.
Right. Well, good afternoon. As David was saying, SPEC LNG, which is the first import terminal of LNG in Colombia, now is a reality. We started operations December of last year, but it's been a little bit more than 10 months. Why Colombia decided to come up with an LNG terminal while we've had local production of natural gas for almost over 40 years. But back in the 2010s, Colombia, as they were saying before, we have a 80% hydro percentage of electricity generation. The other 20% is complemented by thermal generation using different liquid fuels, including natural gas. At that time, the thermal generators using natural gas were having take-or-pay contracts for supply that didn't match their dispatch profile, because they were variable in terms of dispatching depending on dry or wet seasons. So they were paying a lot of money in take-or-pay contracts, and they were not using the natural gas when there was a wet season. But when there was dry seasons, they were consuming a lot of natural gas that was supposed to be to the entire demand of Colombia. So that put pressure a lot on the prices. So also additionally, what was happening is that Colombia envisioned some possible shortage in local supply by year 2015, 2016. So after evaluating several options that could solve Colombia's problem at that time, it was decided that an LNG import terminal was the best solution to either satisfy to guaranteed electricity generation in any given time, whether wet or dry season, and also will liberate a little bit on the supply of natural gas and don't disrupt the, let's say, the regulated or the stable demand that commercial, industrial, residential, and other industrial consumers has. So that's when Colombia decided to open a bid process to get LNG terminal. That was going to be used only for the electricity sector, and that was going to be paid by the entire electricity system of Colombia. That's when LNG, SPEC LNG, won the bid. They started construction in April 2015. Successfully were able to finish it on 18 months. Been operating since December of last year. And we have a terminal user agreement with 3 clients, which are the main thermal generators in Colombia, that they account up to 2,000 megawatts in installed capacity. Our terminal, it's 170,000 cubic meter of LNG of storage capacity, and we have a regas capacity of 400 million cubic feet per day. That represents around 40% of the demand of Colombia, the entire demand. So we've since December, we've been able to receive 2 LNG cargoes, one in December and one in July. They were bought from Trinidad and Tobago, but hopefully we envision to have more LNG cargoes from other parts of the world and in the US. The way that we see it is that we do think LNG is now part of the energy matrix or the local supply in Colombia, and it will continue to be that way, and I envision some increased participation in that. And also the fact that our terminal has some excess storage capacity that could be a key player in the development of LNG into regional markets that have smaller demands and could be well served with a hub and spoke structure.
Great. Could you talk a little bit about how the project is financed? Because I think a lot of countries are trying to figure out how do you address this challenge of having a plant that's there for backup, but maybe it has 40 or 50% utilization. So if you're the project developer and you don't necessarily have the state behind you, how do you set this up in a way so that you can survive that volatility?
Right. No, the project itself, since it was a decision by the government, at that time I was saying that the thermal generators that are there for backup in terms of dry season, they receive from the government what is called a reliability charge that actually they backs up their operation just to be there. So back in the 2010s, the government was spending a lot of money on these take or pay contracts of supply because those costs were passed through to the market or through the entire system. So by doing the LNG terminal, what was doing the government was actually doing savings in terms of their cost of energy supply, and now it's being backed by reliability charge that is being paid by the government to the thermal generator, and they have a back-to-back contract with us that pays for that infrastructure to be there, ready whenever it's needed.
That's terrific. Giovani, let me turn to you. Now you've got a unique role. You're with Brazil's energy planning agency, so we're going to hold you responsible for predicting the future and telling us how things are going to go. But tell us a little bit now about both currently, what share does gas have in Brazil's energy economy, and how important is LNG? And then how do you see the next 10 years or so? Do you see that role of LNG increasing, and if so, what's the framework going to be for building those new facilities?
Okay, thank you, David. Good afternoon to everyone. Well, LNG started in Brazil as part of energy security, as David mentioned, because of supply threats on the supply from Bolivia in 2006, and so there is 3 existing terminals in Brazil. The first 2 was in operation in 2009, and the third one started in 2014. But afterwards, since we have energy matrix very concentrated on hydropower plants. It's around 65% of the matrix. So, and because of environmental issues, we are not allowed to build new large reservoir anymore. And in the last couple of years, the wind and solar power generation increased a lot in Brazil, which brings the problem of intermittence. LNG starts to have a key role in guarantee the stability of supply. Of course, considering the whole picture, it's not as big as Argentina. In gas as a whole has 10%, roughly 10% of the primary energy matrix, but it's getting larger and larger. In the future, what we see is we will need some LNG projects additionally to keep the electricity and power security. And well, the huge challenge is how to deal with all the volatility and uncertainties related to the weather as in Argentina and Colombia. Because, for instance, currently, the gas demand is split in 60% of non-thermal demands and 40% on thermal electricity demand. And in a dry season, it might be 50-50, as it happened in 2014 and 2015. So, and this probably will get worse in the future. And recently, we had a simulation in EPE about if we need to address all the intermittence demand, seasonality demand, and peak demand through gas-fired power plants, the market will double. We don't believe that all this demand will be addressed by LNG and gas. It will have to compete in the market, for instance, with pump-stored hydro that people start to talk about again in Brazil, and also demand-side management and biomass fired power plant. And I mean, the key point is how to find a business model that fits all this together.
Do you have an estimate of how much more LNG you think Brazil will need in, say, 10 years out? Do you think the volume will double?
It was, we considered in this case that it's a low probability to happen. Important to keep it in mind. Mm-hmm. 6 new terminals, considering each one of 14 million cubic meters per day. So it's a lot, but once again, we don't believe that all this demand will be addressed by gas. But even then, there is another LNG terminal under construction in the northeast of the country, and is the first one totally private. So it might bring a lot of change. It's a Goldwyn power project with a supply agreement with ExxonMobil. So will change a lot. And there is 2 other in licensing process. So, and
private or Petrobras?
No.
Both are private.
The new ones are all private, at least that's what has been announced so far.
And then, of course, if you're an LNG importer and you're looking for your customers, the structure of the market makes a big difference. So, so far, Petrobras built the terminals, takes the risks, provides the supply. So are there any regulatory changes afoot in Brazil that will give more security to private suppliers that they can find their customer and deliver their gas to their customer?
Yeah, we have this initiative called Gas to Grow that is seeking to implement a lot of improvements in legal and regulation issues. There are some improvements that is already in place for the auctions in December, power auctions in December. One of them is what we are calling seasonal inflexibility. That the company, the LNG company, will have inflexibility, a seasonal inflexibility during the year. So with match with the dry season for hydropower plants. So there is some adjustments being made to increase, to reduce the uncertainties and the volatilities for the business. So I think we are facing those problems, but of course we don't have the crystal ball. So it's a very complex
You're the planning minister.
issue.
You have to have a crystal ball. We are constructing the new market, the market design together with the market currently. So there was a very broad discussions. I had the opportunity to coordinate the one of the subcommittees of Gas to Growth related to third-party access, and I can guarantee you it's more than 60 private association discussing with us all the changes we are planning to have in the next couple of years. Terrific. Sue, let me turn to you. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what are the U.S. interests in this region, and do you have a vision or an aspiration for how the region will progress on LNG? And of course, since you're the Energy Bureau, and what are you doing to be helpful?
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks to the Atlantic Council really for gathering, giving us a spot to gather. I think I'm just honored to be up here with so much energy expertise. And I'm learning this issue too as we go. So I just want to say I think, as you can tell, there's a lot of dynamism in Latin America right now on the energy front, and happy coincidence that the revolution in the U.S. energy markets happens to coincide with so much development in demand in Latin America for this for gas and other energy products. I just think I think the statistics are quite remarkable. I think since the U.S. started exporting the LNG in 2016, I think there's been something like 190 shipments that have gone out of the United States. 44% of those have gone to Latin America. So I think the growth possibility is there, the export possibility for U.S. companies. I think the fact that there are so many people in the room who've come to hear what these experts have to say is an example of that. So a happy coincidence. I'm going to be the first one to say it, gentlemen. Win-win, I think, for our region. Because I do think from the foreign policy perspective, it's important for us to see exports from U.S. Companies, great, exports from Trinidad, whatever. But most importantly, to see that there's energy security and stability of supply. I was in Chile last month for the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas meeting, and the one thing that the energy ministers there stressed repeatedly is the importance of the energy security for the foundations for economic prosperity in the region. And economic prosperity as we talked about yesterday, gentlemen, leads to the stability in the region, and our friends are happy, they're prosperous, we're happy and prosperous. So I think it is actually the folks who planned this trip, which started a few months ago, right? We started thinking of bringing folks up here a few months ago, but we're really glad that they could take time out of their busy schedules to come here. But if I don't take over your job, I have a question for them, because one of the things that the ministers talked a lot about at the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas was the importance of regional integration. So what we've heard here from each of you is what's going on in your country. But is there any planning or is there any forethought given to how do you connect with your Latin American neighbors? How do you make those pipelines that are there, the future connections work to, again, keep the security of supply, the region connected? And it's one thing to do it country by country, but we also think it's important to have the regional interconnections. Does anyone want to? Am I stealing
no,
your,
that's a
your,
great
your
segue. And I
question?
just add on to that? Are there any inherent complementarities, either because of weather or seasonality, between the countries where it would promote this kind of integration or sharing?
Well, in the case of our country, in Argentina, historically we had a relationship with regards to energy with Chile and Bolivia. With Bolivia, as I mentioned, we already have a contract that will go for a long run. And with Chile, we used to export energy to Chile, but that changed in the last years due to our own going down of the gas production. And during 2016, we import energy from Chile. Chile was selling us energy they were importing LNG, and they were selling natural gas to Argentina. The way I see it is that once, at least from our country perspective, is once we really know what the potential for Vaca Muerta will be, once we know how the unconventional market will go from there and the production, we are definitely gonna make some disbalance in the whole region in the sense that if we get to have the volumes that we want to have, we may probably be able to start exporting back probably to Chile. That will compete a little bit with the LNG imports on that country, and that of course will depend on price. For us, unconventional at the very beginning will be not a cheap gas until we resolve all the issues due to cost of production, and we start going up the learning curve in that sense. But also the contract with Bolivia, we have it. We expect at some point that we may have our own gas production that can replace that. And of course, we were saying with Giovani that we should work much more integrated between the countries in the near future, because of course the relationship between Brazil and Argentina is very special and very significant in the region, and we will have to see how that role will develop. From Argentina perspective, we are still in the process, like I said before, of normalizing the market, so we're thinking a lot internally on how to solve our issues. But of course, in a 10 years time, we're going to have to start thinking much more about the integration, about also a legal framework for this exchange of energy with these countries, and also rebuilding or regaining the trust between our countries in order to start thinking of energy going and coming to the different neighbors that we have in here. So that's more or less our view.
Good. Giovani? Okay, great. Go ahead. Sorry.
Basically, as Gonzalo said, we need to work much more in regional integration, mainly in the South Cone. Bolivia, Brazil, and Argentina are somehow integrated. When Argentina had the problem in the past, it also stopped the supply to the south of Brazil, and because of that, integration was postponed. So I think it's not about soccer, so we can integrate. Sorry about the joke. But in any case, sure, there is a lot of win-win potentials, opportunities, with logistics advantage to be taken, and enhancing the efficiency of the whole system of the South Cone. So we really should work on that after the game.
Jose Maria?
Yeah, sure. In Colombia, in terms of natural gas, we have a regional integration with Venezuela. We have a pipeline that connects our national grid system into a very big well in Venezuela that we've exported natural gas from the year 2008 to 2015 to Venezuela. They have significant reserve, but they haven't made the investments in order to get that natural gas out and have market. So we exported to them 8 years with the commitment of having the same natural gas that we exported back to us when it's needed for us, but there's uncertainty when that's going to happen and if that's going to happen. But there's a pipeline that integrates our national grid system to their major natural gas well. That's infrastructure related. In terms of integration, we believe the existence of the SPEC as a hub or as a LNG terminal, and considering that we have opposite weather conditions in the northern part of South America with the southern, we have opposite that could create some synergies in order to have like to contract supply that could complement each other, based that considering that the three of our countries have LNG mostly for power generator in dry seasons, and the dry seasons are kind of opposite. There's a lot of synergies that we envision that could happen as a region to be like a regional buyer and have the flexibility in order to attend different markets.
That's interesting, yeah, because it seems there may be an advantage that essentially all of the countries, probably operate around 50% utilization of your capacity. So it creates a little bit of a shadow Southern Cone LNG storage facility. And one of the challenges in the global LNG market is there is no excess capacity. There is no really excess storage. Does the legal framework exist for you all to be able to trade cargoes and storage? You're private, so you have a little bit more flexibility. But in Argentina and Brazil, where the state has at least a hand in the current structure, is that permissible? Is that possible?
Yes, it is possible in Brazil. The problem is taxations. So there are some issues to be faced in taxation, but it's already under discussion. So it probably will be easier in the future. Because currently, a reload cargo needs to pay tax as well. So there is some discussion to change the point where tax are applied. So if there is no a landed cargo, so you shouldn't pay tax for this reload. That's one issue that is under discussion in Brazil.
Correct. In Argentina, is it permissible?
In the case of Argentina, we are now working in a regulation in order to try to see how we envision that the commercialization of LNG would be in the near future, and we would like to be that becomes open to the market and for the privates to make their own business. In that sense, we haven't thought or put too much thought on this idea of having these terminals as potential storage places. But the idea is that could happen. We are working in the regulation nowadays. It's going to be something by the beginning of next year that we're going to have. The idea is that these terminals, in general, they don't have much activity in the summer months, so it can be an opportunity. We'll put some more thought on that.
I mean, right now, in one way or the other, the government has taken a role in providing energy security for the country by making sure there's capacity, taking the capital risk, providing some assurance so that the capacity exists. So I guess going forward, how do you see your countries managing this question of reliability? Who ultimately will pay for this excess capacity? Is it the ratepayer? Is it the utility? And I think you also have said earlier you think that essentially more of the LNG facilities will become private. So will this payment for reliability or for capacity come from the electricity system? Will it come from the gas system? You can paint a picture a little bit about where you see it coming, and maybe you can start off a little bit and talk about how Colombia is doing this, because that's a good public-private model.
Right. As I was saying before, Colombia's actual, like our terminal, it's being paid, or this security, it's being paid by the electrical system, because that's the, they are the actual beneficiaries of the terminal being there, just to guarantee that the electricity. But Colombia is currently on a debate, or because they've identified some potential shortage of natural gas supply, considering our terminal and local supply for year 2023-2024. So they're thinking of a second LNG import terminal, but that's their ambition to be used only for the natural gas sector. And that's where the debate is coming. So who's going to pay for that? Because there are some natural gas users that they don't need that because it's more on a reliability, eventual reliability. Mm-hmm. So I think the government has to come up or develop an efficient regulatory framework in order to make feasible that investment or that terminal that doesn't affect the competitiveness of the natural gas sector. There's industrial players, there are also commercial and other sectors that there's going to be some impact in their competitiveness if they have an extra fee. So it has to be well defined in order to be sustainable in the longer term. So the regulatory agency have a great challenge to make that happen.
Great. Well, that's a $1 million answer, right? It's a huge discussion on Brazil about that, how to share the costs and the risks of natural gas, and particular to LNG cargoes. There is no answer yet, it's under discussion, but what the complexity of the issue is, if you put all the burden on the power gas-fired power plants, it won't be competitive in the auctions with other sources of electricity generation. Currently, since Petrobras has basically all the market, the price is like an average portfolio. So the problem, it's not marginalized. It's everybody pays for the inefficiency, for the high spare capacity. But in the future, as you mentioned, the situation will be more complicated as private agents get into the market. What we have been hearing is that somehow the private sector find a business model, because I just mentioned it, Golar Power and ExxonMobil has won an auction, and there is a LNG and a power plant under construction in the northeast of Brazil. So apparently the the arrangements we have today, it's not optimum, but it's working out for the business model private. And recently for the auctions, power auctions in December, there is a lot of habilitation projects by EPE for the next auction in December. A lot, like 40% of the auction are projects based on gas, mostly LNG, including Cheniere. So Shell, all the majors. So somehow, I think and the private sector find a way to put the business ahead. Of course, there is a lot of room for improvements, and we are trying to deal with this.
Good. Sounds like a good opportunity for a regulatory creativity workshop, you know.
You know, I think that's probably great. We'll put that on the work list for the next quarter.
And Argentina, are you all thinking about some of the same issues?
Yeah, well, in the case of Argentina, since we are now working in this new regulation, because we saw that if the LNG market is to be grown, then they will have to have some regulation in place that is still doesn't exist for the time being. So this is the discussion we are having today. The way I think we see it from the government is this should be an initiative for the private sector. Anyone that is willing to build a terminal should be able to come in. What we want to put in place is a regulation that will somehow facilitate that this kind of business can go along. But the idea is that the government will not take a position to secure anything to anyone. The idea will be that the private sector take the risks. What we are probably thinking is that someone that may want to get in, may want to invest in a terminal, that they can have some contracts, and that those contracts for the primary capacity should be with someone that is willing to commit for that, but also that if that capacity is not being used, once the terminal is in operation, the idea is that that capacity should be released to the market for someone else to use it. So in that way, you cannot create any dominant position for someone in the market, and you can make it as free and as open as possible. But the idea is to have the facility, to have as much LNG as possible, and that the market will be willing to buy. So that's more or less the approach. We are building this regulation in order to make it easier for anyone.
Terrific. Are all of you spot buyers of LNG? Are your LNG projects? So,
yes.
You know, a big debate here is the question of, is security of supply at risk if you don't have enough long-term contracts to build these gasification units? I guess my question, to some extent, you probably already answered it because you're buying spot, but are you worried at all about long-term price or long-term security of supply buying on a spot basis, or the entities that in your countries, or do you look out in the market and assume that by 2022 the gas market's going to look just like the oil market? It's going to be a largely spot, very liquid, tradable market.
Well, we definitely monitor the market, the LNG. Right now, Colombia has been buying spot, but we envision that maybe after 2019, 2020, there's some local supply contracts that are going to be expiring that the thermal generators have. So that could open, and that will open the space for maybe long-term contracts for Colombia after 2020s. That's what we envision. But we definitely monitor the market. We do expect that the supply will continue after 2022, and eventually the market will itself be like compensate within supply and demand. But definitely.
What do the planners plan for?
Well, we see that there is a risk because the market usually balances itself as time being. So we don't believe that the cheap gas will be forever. But of course, we don't know when the market will turn. Recently, what we see is in the after 5 years ahead, the price takes some adjust, but as we learned today, there is a lot of more supply coming in from the US, so maybe not in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. So in any case, what we see is the best way to dealing with this is have a kind of portfolio with some long-term contracts and some spot contract, and each agent will find their own bet, so their own market view for the future and assume their own risks. So as Gonzalo said, what we are seeking for in Brazil currently is a much more diversified, open and private market in gas industry. So that's what we are trying to design, to improvement all the competitiveness issues, and I mean, we want a real market, not a small one.
Gotcha. Gonzalo?
In the case of Argentina, I think that as long as the terminals keep being owned by the government, we'll probably keep this spot market thing in the timing. In the future, the idea is that if there can exist the long-term contracts, that could be more interesting, but it will depend on how the market goes. We'll try to place a regulation that will facilitate this, but I cannot answer on that question at this point.
Okay. Sue, let me turn to you. We've talked a lot about the Southern Cone, but I know the State Department and the government's done a lot of work in Central America and the Caribbean, and obviously with all the catastrophes because of the hurricanes, electricity infrastructure is really very much in play because so much of it has to be rebuilt. Could you share with the audience a little bit about what you've done so far to promote LNG access in Central America and the Caribbean, and maybe anything you've got on the books?
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done in that area, and I have to just say, I mean, when you were talking about these three countries in particular, maybe if we'd invited someone from Mexico to join the crowd too, we'd have the countries in the region that have done the most to open their energy markets and have made the reforms that have really, contributed to this dynamic change. But I think, my background is in trade, and I'm just, the newcomer on this whole crowd on energy. But I think I see a lot of parallels, because what we talked about in the trade world was that what you needed to have was the enabling environment for the trade to flow. And I think this is clear in these countries too. If the governments make the changes legislatively, if they make the changes even constitutionally in some cases, if they make the changes with the regulations like you were talking about, that enables a lot of the rest of the market to do a lot of the rest of what needs to be done. So from the Energy Bureau perspective, when we're looking at energy policies, we're working in areas, our energy programs, we have a small pot of money that we can design for our programs, and we can help the countries work in those enabling environments. We've got technical expertise in the United States, in places working with the unconventional gas, whether we're working on, or even just the planning, the prognostications, how do you calculate and do looking at the numbers. We've brought some folks in, programs like these, we've been doing some training. Depending on what countries need, they've approached us, and we're working very closely in places like Central America to try to encourage the countries to link up, get those transmission lines hooked up. It's harder than you think, and we've been working on it for a long time, but I think we're getting to the point now where we're seeing a critical mass of movement where we can actually see some connections and see some efficiencies in the markets because of that.
That's terrific, and I think I think the Department of Energy has proposed a regulation that would expedite, sort of basically the permitting process for small-scale LNG in the Caribbean.
Yeah, any comments on that? I think we're waiting for comments, right, on that.
I'll give you one. Good idea. Yeah,
good idea.
Congratulations. That's right. Great.
Anybody from energy here?
We have a lot of energy expertise in the audience, people from governments, from the analytical community, from the media as well. So let me open the floor to the audience and see what questions people have. While people are gathering their courage, let me just ask one on Bolivia in particular. Bolivia has been a volatile supplier, and maybe you want to talk about what your expectations are for Bolivian supply. I mean, it's particularly for Brazil and Argentina, that's important. Or what's your margin of error, I guess, in terms of how things might be? And those who have questions, raise your hands so we can see where you are.
Okay. But we have no doubt that Bolivia has the potential to add gas to its reserves, but it has to be proven. And there is, as we are following the numbers, the figures, there's not enough investments in exploration in the last couple of years. So we don't believe it will be possible to renew the whole contract, 30 million cubic meters per day, at the end of 2019. So what we are considering in our reference case scenarios is that after 2021, because there is a make-up period of the contract because of the take-or-pay, the volume will reduce from 30 million cubic meters per day to 20 as a reference case. But we won't be surprised if it will be 16 instead of 20. So we're not that worried right now because we have a lot of LNG spare capacity. So, but basically, that's the problem with Bolivia. It's not the resource potential, but probably the over the ground geopolitics and business environment.
Yeah. Is all similar view?
Yeah, for us in Argentina it's the same. If Brazil is worried, we are a little bit more worried, mainly because sometimes Bolivia just, when they need to cut, they just send it to Brazil and not to Argentina. It's probably the price, of course. But we have, as Giovani said, we also have a spare capacity in LNG, and that's probably why also a third terminal can be quite attractive, in order just to balance whenever we have this lower gas income from Bolivia. So in a way, we will try to replace it with LNG. And if not, of course, the ones that will suffer will be the industry and the power plants that will still have to import more gas oil in order to do their activities.
To make it great. All right. We'll start with the gentleman here, and then the lady in the third row, and then Ambassador Morningstar.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Breifogel. I'm a designer of micro-distributed generation, natural gas or short hydrocarbon chain equipment, 2 or 3 kilowatt hours, 2 or 3 kilowatt capacity. If you have natural gas piped into your home, your residence, you would be a target for my organization. I was hoping that each of you by country could comment on the density of residents which actually have natural gas service, whether you see a potential to stabilize your electricity markets by having generation all the way out at the end of the end user, and finally, how much renewable, let's say photovoltaic, is being integrated from production. We have lots of rooftop production, people's houses here in the United States, and a lot of that is being sold back into the grid. So those 3 questions, please.
That's great. I think we'll take a couple at a time. So let's take a question from the back.
Hi, my name is Andrea Murta. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latin America Center here at the Council. I have a question for Giovani, and I apologize because it's an impossible one to answer, but I just want to hear your opinion. We talked a little bit about the business environment and the political environment, and Brazil is one where the volatility has been known, to put it mildly. And we have elections next year. So how do you see the politics playing out to help the plans that you have laid out be implemented in the long term? And do you think that Brazil is in a path that is not going to turn back no matter who gets elected or how volatile the politics gets going forward?
Andrea, always the easy question. Huh? Ambassador Morningstar?
Yeah, thanks. I had a question about Argentina and maybe probe a little bit deeper. You've made some allusion to possibly exporting gas in the future to regional countries. Companies are now getting re-excited again after the YPF, I'll say YPF fiasco, and investing in Argentina in major projects in shale. I know that the first priority is your domestic, to satisfy your domestic needs, but what kind of a priority is it for increasing production to the point that Argentina could become a significant exporter, perhaps a global exporter?
Great. All right. Gonzalo, you want to go first?
Which one do you
well, I think maybe take the exporter question first, and then the question on gas penetration. You know, and in the residential sector, is the distribution network being built out, and how big is solar PV going to be?
Yeah, in the last 10, 12, 15 years, we have become an importer of energy, and that was not the case for Argentina on all their history, on all our history. So we think our main concern at this point is just to regain our own energy supply. So Vaca Muerta became a reality 5-6 years ago. Now we are putting things or trying to plan for that, and we'll see how far it can go. Of course, that for us will be the main thing to achieve, or our main goal is just to know that we have energy for all our needs. The way we see, we are not thinking a lot of exports in the near future, I would say. If we can export, we will do so to Chile, mainly because all the infrastructure and the facilities are in place. But I would say we will have to think about how it will be in the future. Of course, if Vaca Muerta comes to be really a success, then we will have to start thinking of a policy or how we would like to export and whom we will have to compete with. But I would say our focus at this point is just trying to see the real potential for Vaca Muerta, seeing how the prices will move in the world in general. But for the time being, that will be the answer.
Great. And do you have a sense of sort of gas share in the residential sector, and sort of I think what's the upside for gas in the residential sector?
Well, we do have around 2 million houses of people, that our more or less in poverty index is around 29%, which has been going down a bit in the last year. And out of that people, around 2 million people do not have access to gas or electricity. So I think that in general terms, there's a good potential for that and for solutions that can be in place and small solutions. Of course, we'll have to see if renewables at some scale can also be a solution for that. I'm not too much into the electricity part of the policy of the government, but I would say the market or the people that would need that is definitely there.
Great. Giovani?
Well, first,
do the politics first.
Brazil is a very war country, so the demand for residential is concentrated on the coast, and electricity is very universalized in Brazil. So So it's close to 100%. So of course, there is some isolated areas that are not covered, but in rough numbers, it's basically 100% of electricity universalization. So it makes very difficult to distributed generation in Brazil, although there are some policies and regulations, recent policies and regulations to stimulate distributed generation, but it has to compete with wind and solar, so it's hard. Okay, then moving to the hot.
Do you need a crystal ball? We've got a couple of extra
Yeah,
ones.
maybe. Well, as I said, the discussions related to gas para crescer, gas to grow, was very broad with the society. So our feeling in EPE is that it's very difficult to after the elections, there's a lot of change on this, because there is a broad perception in the country that those changes are in the proper way. Of course, there are some discussions in the old government, old administration, about those issues, but it was not a top priority. It became a top priority in the new government. So, of course, the new government is putting a lot of effort to go forward on these issues and approve all the changes in legislation and regulation to implement and design a much more competitive and efficient marketplace. But even if a totally different government assumed the administration after 2018, I think it was really hard to backward some of those changes. Because of this, the support of different stakeholders, and also because there are some reality puts some barriers, let's say. For instance, Petrobras has no money to take those action back, to assume all the risk by itself. So I don't think that it will be possible to maybe the rhythm, the pace of the changes change, but I think this is for good.
Great. You've got an election coming up as well.
Yeah.
In Colombia.
In terms of Colombia, to answer Mark's question, Colombia has been very successful in massifying the use of natural gas. Today we have around 8.7 million users of natural gas in Colombia. That represents a little bit more than 70% of the population in Colombia. We have a robust infrastructure or pipeline system that have a very, very well penetration to those cities or those urban settings for consumption. So there's a lot of potential to use, to come up with innovative solutions to using natural gas in different uses. In terms of photovoltaic or solar in Colombia, we're still doing the first baby steps. 2 years ago, there was a law that called, it's 1715, but it's a law that promoted and gives some incentives in terms of tax incentive to promote the investments in renewables. But it's still in baby steps. There's the potential in terms of radiation in several portions of the country, but still that has to be developed. I hope that answers your question.
Great. All right, let's take a few more. Gentleman here in the back. And we'll get your microphone. Just identify yourself.
Hi, Larry McCabe with the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. My question is regional integration, in particular about potential regulatory effects. I think in some of the regional organizations, such like UNASUR, Mercosur, even the Pacific Alliance, I think in each there's been mention of a dialogue on regional integration and making sure that energy is available to all the countries in the organization. Is that an active dialogue? And if so, where do you see that regulatory effort playing out in the LNG business?
Any takers?
Well, the dialogue exists. Since all the countries involved has their own domestic agenda, it might not be in the pace it should be. But there are plans to go forward with integration because there is this perception that is a win-win opportunities related to that. And just to make my former saying clear, we do believe that in the future, Bolivia will be important to Brazil. So the infrastructure is there. It's important to regional geopolitics to keep the neighbors stable. So it's not. I'm not saying that it will be less volumes forever, but at least for some period will be reduced. I think if we take the example of European Union process, it's a long process. So first it starts with like bilateral agreements, and then you start working on the regulations, unifications, and things like that. So it's a long process. So I think the volumes will be there before the integration, the regulatory integration. But my sense is that several countries is going to the same direction, trying to have a more open and competitive market. So I think we are in the right road.
Okay, great. Other questions here? In your pointing. Gentleman right here, third row.
Thank you so much. My name is Sergio Martinez. I'm interning in the energy program at the Inter-American Dialogue. So I want to ask you a question about legal mechanisms and mechanisms of trust to build collaboration among different countries in terms of the regional integration, especially when it comes to pursue a more competitive framework for private sector participation, which is basically in terms of efficiency. And I'm also interested to know the role of the international community, for example, the international banking systems or business association that can leverage to some extent risk implied in the process. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, just to give you, Colombia's been very open to multilateral support and in terms of ways of having integration among the region. Just to give you an idea, in electricity we have integration with Ecuador, and we were able to import some energy back in the time when needed. Very proactive in looking for integration with Panama and other regions and other countries around the region, and very proactive in receiving multilateral support in developing those type of projects. Hope that answers.
For us in Argentina, is key, and we have identified as key to have a legal framework for all these exchanges and for all these inter-regional relationships that are going to be built in the future. Like Giovani was saying a few minutes ago, we need to work probably on a faster pace, or that we would like to go there, but of course the domestic problems that each of us has are taking us some time from having this discussion. In particular, for example, we as a regulator are having for one particular subject, which is offshore bidding rounds, meetings with Uruguay that has already been there, and with them, with the regulators from that country, we are working together to see what things went well, what things are to be changed, and so forth. So I think this should become more common in the coming years. Of course, in the case of Argentina, it's a new administration, and we are a bit busy solving our internal problems first, but we should go there. And definitely we should have a legal framework that should apply to Latin America and its particularities in the future. But it still has to get there.
It's interesting, I mean, from the conversation we've had this morning, sometimes it's not so much a supranational legal framework that you need, it's the removal of internal barriers. So you've talked about removal on interior barriers, taxation, to allowing trade. Sometimes in the Mexican case that Sue mentioned, you can change the internal market to allow open access, as I think all of you have talked about today. If you have open access to pipelines, if you have no barriers to trade, if you have an open market so that energy consumers can buy their supply from someplace else, then sometimes you don't need another legal framework. You just need to be able to allow the market to work. The Atlantic Council has made a couple of recommendations. I'll just plug a couple of them here. I guess one of them is with respect to the multinationals. Not every multinational development bank has been equally interested in financing gas infrastructure and access. The Inter-American Development Bank has been very strong. The World Bank, I think, has been a bit more ambivalent. So there's probably opportunity for using our voting power in the multilateral development banks to look at financing infrastructure, financing the purchase, I mean, sort of credit support and things like that. So a number of the Arsht Center reports have talked about that. And the other, it's hard to have an event that talks about the hemisphere without mentioning NAFTA. Clearly in Mexico, the reforms there allowed foreign capital and technology to come into the country, and they're just beginning to make changes in the electricity sector, in the upstream sector, and it has tremendous gains for prosperity. It only exists with investor protections to allow people to invest and be sure they could get their money in and they can get their money out. So I think the Southern Cone has been stronger on those investor protections, but that's another area where it's where there is a multilateral legal regime, and it's probably good the way it is. The trick is not to mess it up. Do you want to jump in there?
No, I just jump in and say that, I think in some places we take it for granted. We don't, in the United States, realize that a lot of the power that we're getting is crossing borders with Canada or with Mexico. I don't think people realize in the Northeast a lot of the power comes from hydropower in Ontario or Quebec. We have transmission lines, we have pipelines that cross the Mexico-Canada border all over the place. We had a lot of attention in the last couple of years in one particular pipeline. But what people didn't realize is there are lots of cross-border infrastructure right now that already exists, and we are connected. And there is more in the planning stages as well. So, keep your eye on that spot. But in the U.S., I think we take it for granted. We don't pay a lot of attention to it, but we actually do have a lot of North American regional connections that enable our markets to be stable. So,
here. Any questions? Mr. Gonzalez in the back.
Hi, Chris Goncalves with Berkeley Research Group. I lead the energy practice there. I would like to pick up on David's question about procurement and the use of spot cargoes, spot pricing, and or long-term contracts. I travel around the world, go to a lot of LNG conferences, and I work with buyers and sellers all over the world. And it's, I think, safe to say now it's becoming an industry consensus that we're headed for another wave of market tightening after the current stage of sort of oversupply and abundance driven by the advent of the US LNG that by 2022, 3 or 4 will be shifting back into a much tighter market. It's going to be very hard to take FID and finance new liquefaction terminals, and Asian demand is responding very well to low LNG pricing, so that prices are likely to firm up, if not blow out, sometime early in the next decade. Given that risk from a procurement perspective in Latin America, how do you see LNG procurement evolving in your countries, and how do you see sort of supply portfolio optimization in terms of the use of term contracts and spot cargoes looking forward? Thank you.
From our point of view, actually we're doing spot purchases, but eventually we envision to have a combination of long-term contracts with spot, and that will try to reflect the pattern or the profile of the necessity for the power generation. We do see some space, and that's going to be subject to the market conditions, to have LNG be participated on more of the stable demand, and not only on the power generator sector. And that will flatten a little bit the uncertainty and not be that volatile, or that expectation of what's going to happen with the spot market, if it's going to be some tightening in the market or not. But we do believe that shift into spot, to a combination between long-term and spot, will eventually happen in the following years in Colombia.
Well, currently in Brazil, everything is spot, but we expected that in the coming years, some contracts will be long-term. First of all, even the long-term is not, it's getting more flexible about reloads and exportation clause, so it will help a lot to develop the market, and also, as I mentioned, currently the main driver to new terminals are electricity generation, and in Brazil there is auctions, and you contract the power generation for a long time. So you have like bonds, kind of bonds, certificates that you can present in the bank to raise funds to finance the investments. It's a lot of risk to the power plant business to be mismatch with the gas supply. So probably as the new entrants, we won't have all the portfolio that Petrobras has today. You have to manage the risk somehow, and probably will be through long-term contracts. That's what we expect in the future.
And in the case of Argentina, I would say we expect in 2 or 3 years' time to have a good idea on the potential of the unconventional, and that will definitely compete to the price of LNG and to the possibility of getting into these long-term contracts. Of course, in the meantime, we'll see how, if the government steps a little bit down from the LNG trading, and probably the power plants will then have an idea on whether they want to go into these long-term contracts and have a more secure price, or whether they want to bet a little bit on what will happen with the unconventional. The idea is to have the capacity so that the gas can come from Neuquén to Buenos Aires, and in that sense, where all the industrial activity is over there, they will have to decide on whether they want to risk a little bit on waiting for that potential, or get into these long-term contracts. For the time being, as in the other countries, it's still a spot, maybe because the government was using it a little bit according to the needs of the moment. But for the time being, it's difficult to tell how it will evolve.
Well, thank you. This has been a very interesting and a rich discussion. I have to say I'm encouraged. There's not only a growing role for LNG in the hemisphere, but it sounds like regulatory structures are changing, market structures are changing, commercial developments are taking off, and there's probably going to be an evolution from really the state-led LNG terminals to a more private sector. However the elections go in the various countries, the drivers seem to be quite solid. So thanks to all of you for coming here and for sharing with us. Thanks to the audience for listening. Thanks to the Energy Center and to the Adrienne Arsht Center for hosting us today. And have a good afternoon. Thank you.